Welcome to a story that Ashwood County, Mississippi tried to bury. A case that still whispers from the riverbanks and courthouse dust. Before we get started, please let me know in the comments where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration. The locations and times of day or night that these verified stories reach are of interest to us. It began with a small notice tucked between ads for tonics and plows in the Ferryman's Ledger on May 16, 1851. Missing, Mrs. Lillian Marsh, wife of Silas Marsh, proprietor of the Blackwood Plantation. Last seen the evening of May 12th. A reward is offered for any information leading to her safe return. What seemed like a routine disappearance would unravel into a story so disturbing officials later scrubbed the records clean, hoping silence would be enough to make it disappear. The Blackwood Plantation sat on a proud bend of the river, a two-story white mansion with columns like bones holding up the sky. From a distance, it represented everything the South celebrated: wealth, order, and a quiet sense of its own righteousness. Silas Marsh had acquired the property in 1842, and by 1849, his account books showed he'd expanded his holdings to over 100 enslaved people. Lillian had arrived from Savannah in 1848. The wedding announcement in the New Orleans Picayune called her a woman of extraordinary beauty and refined accomplishment, a description that must have amused anyone who had actually met her. Lillian was not the delicate bird-like figure society expected of a planter's wife. She was chubby, with a full, round face and a figure that carried a noticeable weight. A private letter from Silas's own sister, written after their first meeting, was more honest. She is pleasant enough, though of a rather heavy constitution, not the flower one expects to find in a fine house. This physical fact, dismissed by polite society, set her apart from the very beginning. Her letters to a cousin in Georgia painted a picture of a woman ill-suited to her gilded cage. "The air here is too heavy to breathe," she wrote. "The house feels like a museum where I am both the exhibit and the ghost." In January of 1850, a man named Jacob was purchased at the New Orleans slave market. The bill of sale, found much later in a dusty estate file, described him as male, approximately 28 years old, literate, skilled in carpentry, of sound body and good temperament. A rare note scrawled at the bottom, likely in Silas's hand, added, "To serve in house, attend to library." For a time, an uneasy calm settled over Blackwood. The plantation's profits from sugarcane grew. Silas's name appeared in county meeting notes, where he argued for stricter controls on the movement of enslaved people. In the journal of a neighboring plantation owner's wife, Lillian is mentioned at social gatherings. She's described as quiet to the point of being invisible, though her eyes, the journal notes, seem to take in everything. An entry from Christmas of 1850 adds that Mrs. Marsh, looking heavier than ever in her winter silks, seemed distracted during the sermon and left before the meal was served. Her physical presence was noticeable, but her spirit seemed to be fading. The spring of 1851 brought the first cracks in the plantation's carefully maintained order. An overseer's log entry from March 5th notes, "Disciplinary action for Jacob found in mistress's sitting room without leave." A later entry from March 22nd indicates J reassigned to field work. But a strange counter-entry dated March 30th returns him to the house with the words, "At mistress's insistence, J returned to library." On May 12, 1851, the day Lillian disappeared, several things happened at once. The overseer's report noted that Silas Marsh had left for New Orleans on business, not expected back for 3 days. The weather log mentioned heavy rain starting at sunset and continuing through the night. The last person to see Lillian was the cook, who later told the sheriff that Mrs. Marsh, her large frame filling the doorway for a moment, had asked for tea to be brought to the library around 8 in the evening. By morning, both Lillian Marsh and the man named Jacob were gone. What followed was the largest search Ashwood County had ever seen. Silas returned from New Orleans and put together search parties that combed the swamps and watched every road. The New Orleans Daily Crescent reported on May 19th that 50 men with dogs were searching for Mrs. Marsh, who they feared had been abducted by a runaway. The story quickly solidified: a respected planter's wife taken by an enslaved man. The headline in the Vicksburg Sentinel read, "Abducted by slave." The article quoted Silas, who claimed that Jacob had developed an unhealthy fixation on Mrs. Marsh because they both liked books. A reward notice was published in papers from Natchez to Mobile, offering $1,000 for the return of Mrs. Lillian Marsh and the capture, dead or alive, of the Negro man Jacob. But the official story started to fray almost immediately. A statement given to the sheriff by Sarah, Lillian's lady's maid, noted that her mistress had been packing a small bag for days, adding things slowly so no one would notice. Sarah mentioned that Lillian had packed her sturdiest, plainest dresses, not her fine silks, as if preparing for a difficult journey. The sheriff crossed that statement out of the official record, but it survived in his private notes. An inventory of Lillian's room showed that not only were clothes and personal items missing, but so were several books from the library, including copies of Voltaire and Rousseau. Silas insisted Jacob had taken them as proof of his crime. As the search stretched into its second week, a riverboat captain reported seeing a white woman and a black man board his boat at a small landing 10 miles downriver from Blackwood on the morning of May 13th. The captain described the woman as heavy-set and wearing a dark veil that covered most of her face. They spoke little, but sat close. When asked if she seemed to be under duress, the captain said, "No more than any woman traveling with a man." The trail went cold in New Orleans. Rumors spread that they'd boarded a ship to Haiti, but no shipping records confirmed it. By summer, the story began to shift. One newspaper hinted that the marriage had been troubled and that cruel treatment might have driven Lillian to flee. Silas threatened to sue, and the papers went back to the abduction story. By autumn, the case was old news. Silas sold the plantation that December and moved to France, citing unhappy memories. The house itself burned to the ground in 1853, officially due to a lightning strike. Local whispers said it was arson, but no one ever investigated. The story might have ended there if not for a sealed tin box found in a French Quarter townhouse in 1961. Inside was a journal, water-damaged but partly readable, with the inscription, "Property of L.M." Historians dated it to the mid-19th century. Only fragments were legible, but they painted a startling picture. One entry from early 1850 reads, "S. treats his books with more tenderness than he has ever shown me. The new man, J., understands their value and speaks of authors I did not expect anyone here to know." A later entry continues, "J and I discussed Rousseau today when S was at the mill. He has learned through paths I cannot imagine, acquiring knowledge despite every barrier." By winter of 1850, the tone shifts. The way S looks at J when he thinks I do not notice. With suspicion, with malice. I fear what may come. And later, S struck me today when I protested J's reassignment. Said I had become too familiar. If only he knew the thoughts that now fill my mind. The final legible entry, undated but likely from early May 1851, is the most revealing. We have agreed. When S goes to New Orleans, the riverboat at dawn. J says there are people in the city who can help us reach Philadelphia. I take only what cannot be replaced. My heart races with fear and something else, perhaps the first true hope I have felt since coming to this dreadful place. The journal sparked new interest. In 1965, research in Philadelphia's city archives uncovered a marriage certificate dated October 1851 between a Leah Davis and a James Carter. Both were listed as free colored persons, a common designation used to provide legal cover. The minister's private records included a note. The woman speaks with a southern accent despite claiming Savannah birth. She is of a fuller figure than most women I have seen travel this path, but her eyes are determined. Husband protective, watches door throughout ceremony. Fear evident. Tax records show that a James Carter opened a small carpentry shop in Philadelphia's 7th Ward. The business operated until 1854, when city directories indicate the Carters moved, possibly to Canada after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. No further official records have been found. In 1859, a brief notice in the New Orleans papers reported the death of Silas Marsh in Paris. He died without heirs and never remarried after the tragic loss of his wife. The most disturbing evidence in the case emerged in 1968, when an archaeological survey of the former Blackwood site uncovered the remains of a root cellar beneath where the main house had stood. Among the charred debris were 3 small items: a woman's pearl hair comb, a carpenter's measuring tool with the initials J.C. scratched into the handle, and fragments of a letter addressed to "My dearest L" that had been hidden in the cellar wall. The letter fragments contained several chilling lines. "Cannot delay," he suspects. Said today he would sooner see you dead than... The date was partially preserved, May 8, 1851, just days before the disappearance. What really happened at Blackwood in May of 1851? The official record offers 2 stories: abduction or escape. A third story, however, was whispered for years in the quarters of neighboring plantations. In 1970, an oral history project recorded an interview with a woman named Martha Price, aged 103. She claimed her grandmother had been a kitchen worker at Blackwood. According to Martha, her grandmother always said that Miss Lillian and Jacob had been planning to leave for months. "The master found one of their notes," Martha said, "and that's when things turned bad. My grandmother said there were 2 stories. The one people told about them running away, and the other one, the one the house slaves whispered. The master caught them before they could leave, and they're still there under the old house foundation." The Blackwood site remained abandoned until 1975. Today it's part of a wildlife management area, accessible only by boat. Visitors report hearing whispered conversations on the wind. In 2011, a history professor reported finding a rusted metal box near the old house foundation. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its pages mostly ruined by water. The few decipherable fragments included a passage that read, "If we are not discovered, this journal will remain hidden, and we shall begin new lives under new names. If the worst occurs, perhaps someone will find these words and know that what existed between us was not what they said. Not a crime or an abduction, but the only freedom either of us had ever truly known." The professor suffered a stroke while in the field, and his notes were deemed unreliable. The box was never relocated. The mystery of Lillian and Jacob remains. A story told in fragments, a journal, a marriage certificate, a whispered account, a pearl comb, each piece a clue in a puzzle that may never be fully solved. For decades, the story of Blackwood was a choice between 2 equally dramatic narratives: a violent abduction or a romantic escape. But the truth, as it often does, lived in the space between the headlines. It lived in the quiet observations of people who were paid to be invisible, in the whispers that traveled from kitchen to quarter, and in the things left unsaid in public. The public record, a carefully curated collection of newspaper clippings and official statements, painted Lillian Marsh in broad, idealized strokes. The New Orleans Picayune, in announcing her marriage to Silas, had called her a woman of extraordinary beauty and refined accomplishment. It was the kind of language used for women who were meant to be displayed, not known. But her physical reality was something different. Surviving portraits, though flattering, show a woman with a full, round face and a figure that was, by the standards of the day, decidedly overweight. A private letter from Silas's sister, written after meeting Lillian for the first time, described her more bluntly. She is pleasant enough, though, of a rather heavy constitution. Not the delicate flower one expects to find in a planter's wife. This detail, seemingly trivial, becomes important when you consider the physical demands of a desperate escape and the dismissive way Silas may have viewed her. The man named Jacob was described in the bill of sale as being of sound body and temperament. The overseer's log, however, contained a more practical assessment. New hand J is strong-backed, clever with his hands, but has a thinking man's eyes. Must be watched. That combination of physical strength and quiet intelligence made him both valuable and dangerous in a place like Blackwood. He could organize a library, but he could also organize other things if given the chance. The plantation itself was a machine designed to prevent such chances. Silas Marsh was obsessed with control. He kept detailed logs not only of finances but of the movements and productivity of every enslaved person on his property. He experimented with different work rhythms, different rations, different forms of punishment, all in pursuit of what he called maximum efficiency. His letters to other planters reveal a man who viewed people as assets to be managed, their humanity an inconvenient variable to be minimized. A well-ordered plantation, he wrote in 1850, is one where sentiment has been replaced by system. Lillian, trapped in this system, found her only refuge in the library. It was a grand room lined with shelves of books that Silas had purchased by the yard as a marker of his status. He rarely opened them. Lillian, however, consumed them. Her letters to her cousin are filled with references to literature, philosophy, and history. These books are the only companions I have in this house, she wrote. They speak a language of ideas that is forbidden everywhere else. It was in this room that she met Jacob. Silas, in a move that mixed arrogance with carelessness, had assigned the literate carpenter to organize the library, a task he considered beneath his own attention. For Jacob, it was a reprieve from the brutal labor of the fields. For Lillian, it was the first time since her arrival that she had someone to talk to who understood that books were more than just decoration. Their conversations began with shelving and cataloging, but soon deepened. According to the fragments of Lillian's journal, they spoke of Rousseau's ideas on social contracts, of Voltaire's critiques of tyranny, of histories of revolutions in other parts of the world. For Lillian, it was an intellectual awakening. For Jacob, it was a dangerous game. He was sharing knowledge that could get him killed, speaking to a white woman in a way that violated every rule of their society. But the shared space of the library, with its silent leather-bound witnesses, became a small pocket of freedom in a world built on bondage. The risk was immense, and it did not go unnoticed. The other house servants, particularly Lillian's maid, Sarah, saw the long hours they spent in the library, the hushed tones of their conversations, the way their eyes would sometimes meet over an open book. Sarah, according to her suppressed statement, tried to warn her mistress. "I told her, Miss Lillian, the master won't like this," she recalled. "She just looked at me with those sad eyes and said, 'The master doesn't like many things about me, Sarah.'" Silas's suspicion grew. He began making unannounced visits to the library, his presence sucking the air out of the room. The overseer's log from the spring of 1851 is dotted with entries that reflect this growing tension. It was after one such confrontation that Silas, in a fit of rage, struck Lillian and ordered Jacob reassigned to the fields, a punishment meant to sever their connection and remind both of them of their place. This act of violence, however, had the opposite effect. It solidified Lillian's resolve. Her journal entry from that period is clear. "He laid his hand on me not for any transgression of my own, but for the crime of conversation. He fears not what we have done, but what we might think. That is a fear I can no longer live with. Her insistence that Jacob be returned to the library was not just a matter of convenience. It was an act of rebellion. Silas, surprised by her uncharacteristic defiance and perhaps concerned about the visible bruise on her face, relented. But the incident had drawn a line. The library was no longer a refuge. It was a battleground. It was then, according to the journal, that the idea of escape took root. It began as a fantasy, a desperate wish whispered between the pages of a book. But Jacob, who had networks and knowledge of the outside world that Lillian could not even imagine, began to turn that fantasy into a plan. He knew of the Underground Railroad, of safe houses in New Orleans, of riverboat captains who could be persuaded to look the other way for the right price. He knew that a chubby, well-dressed white woman, though an unlikely runaway, was also the perfect disguise. No one would suspect her of fleeing. They would assume she was a lady traveling, perhaps to visit family. The plan was audacious. They would leave on a night when Silas was away, taking advantage of the reduced security. They would travel downriver to New Orleans, a city with a large and well-established community of free people of color, where they could disappear more easily than anywhere else in the South. From there, they would make their way north to Philadelphia, a city with a strong abolitionist presence. The risks were terrifying. For Lillian, it meant abandoning her status, her wealth, her family, everything that defined her in the eyes of the world. It meant becoming a fugitive, living in constant fear of discovery. For a woman of her size and accustomed to a sedentary life, the physical hardship of such a journey would be immense. For Jacob, the risks were even greater. If caught, he faced certain death. But the alternative, remaining at Blackwood under Silas's increasingly violent and paranoid rule, was becoming unbearable for both of them. Their preparations were meticulous and secret. Lillian began gathering small essential items, money, jewelry she could sell, a change of clothes, and most importantly, the books that had become symbols of their shared intellectual life. She packed them slowly, a few at a time, in a small leather valise that she kept hidden. Jacob, meanwhile, used his limited freedom of movement to make contacts, secure passage, and gather information. The letter fragments found in the root cellar provide a chilling glimpse into their final days at Blackwood. Jacob's warning, "He suspects," said today he would sooner see you dead than, suggests that Silas's jealousy had escalated to the point of murderous threats. This was no longer just about a forbidden friendship. It was a matter of life and death. The letter confirms that they had planned to leave earlier but had been delayed. The escape on May 12th was not just a bid for freedom. It was a race against time. The second narrative, the one whispered in the quarters and passed down through generations, offers a darker possibility. In this version, Silas discovered their plan before they could execute it. His trip to New Orleans was a ruse, a trap to catch them in the act. According to the account given by Martha Price, whose grandmother worked in the kitchen, Silas returned to the plantation unexpectedly on the night of May 12th. Grandma said the house went quiet in a way that wasn't right, Martha recalled in her 1970 interview. The master came in through the back, not the front. There was a noise from the library, a crash, and then nothing. The next morning, the master said they had run away. But my grandmother, she saw them cleaning the library rug before the sun was up. She saw Aldous, the overseer, carrying something heavy out to the cellar. She said they weren't looking for Miss Lillian and Jacob in the swamp. They were making sure they stayed where they'd been put. This version of events, while never proven, aligns with several disturbing pieces of evidence. The discovery of Lillian's hair comb and Jacob's tool in the root cellar suggests they were both in that space at some point. The traces of accelerants found at the site of the 1853 fire point to arson, a convenient way to destroy a crime scene. And Silas's hasty departure for France, abandoning a profitable plantation, seems less like the act of a heartbroken husband and more like that of a man fleeing his own guilt. Which story is true? Did they escape to a new life in the North, their love and courage triumphing over the oppressive system that sought to crush them? Or did they meet a brutal end, their bodies buried beneath the house where they had dared to dream of freedom? The historical record, with its frustrating gaps and contradictions, allows for both possibilities. Perhaps the truth is a combination of both. Perhaps they made it as far as the river, only to be caught and brought back. Perhaps one escaped while the other was captured. The journal of Silas's sister provides one final ambiguous clue. In a letter dated 1858, a year before Silas's death, she wrote of visiting him in Paris. He is a changed man, haunted by what he calls the Louisiana business. He drinks heavily and speaks of her often, sometimes as if she is in the next room, sometimes as if she is at the bottom of the river. He confessed to me one night that he saw her in a dream, standing on the bank of the Mississippi, not the delicate girl he married, but heavier, stronger, looking at him with an expression he could not name. She was not alone. The man, the carpenter, was with her. They did not speak, but he knew they had come to collect something he owed them. This dream, a vision of a powerful, confident Lillian, her physical weight a symbol of her newfound strength and presence, haunts the story. It suggests that even if Silas had managed to erase their physical bodies, he could not erase their existence. They lived on, either in reality or in his conscience, a constant reminder of the freedom he could not control and the humanity he could not extinguish. The chubby woman he had married for convenience had become a figure of formidable power, her escape, whether real or imagined, a final damning judgment on the man and the system he represented. The story of Blackwood, as told in public, was a story of boundaries. The line between black and white, between owner and property, between a man's home and the world outside, these were lines Silas Marsh believed were as fixed as the stars. His wife's disappearance, whether by abduction or by choice, represented a catastrophic breach of that order. His response was to reassert control with all the force he could muster. The search parties he organized were less about finding Lillian and more about punishing Jacob. The reward notice, offering money for Jacob's capture, dead or alive, was a declaration of war. The narrative of the violent, lustful slave abducting his innocent white mistress was a powerful and familiar trope in the antebellum South. It served to justify the brutal system of slavery, reinforcing white fears and rationalizing the use of extreme violence to maintain control. Silas leaned into this narrative, using it to deflect any suspicion that might fall on him. He gave interviews to newspapers, painting a picture of a devoted husband devastated by the loss of his beloved wife. He described Jacob as a cunning and dangerous figure who had taken advantage of Lillian's gentle nature. But behind this public performance, a different story was unfolding. The people who lived and worked at Blackwood, the enslaved men and women who were the silent witnesses to the plantation's daily life, knew the official narrative was a lie. They had seen the tension between Silas and Lillian. They had heard the raised voices, seen the bruises Lillian tried to hide with powder. They knew that the relationship between Lillian and Jacob was not one of predator and prey, but of two lonely people finding solace in a shared intellectual world. Their whispers formed a counter-narrative, a secret history passed from person to person in the kitchens, the fields, and the quarters. This was a story not of abduction, but of a desperate bid for freedom. It was a story of two people who dared to cross the most heavily guarded boundary of their time. The role of Lillian's physical appearance in this secret history is significant. To the outside world, her weight was a sign of indulgence, a lack of discipline. But within the context of her escape, it becomes a symbol of her resilience. The journey to freedom was not an easy one. It required physical and mental fortitude. For a woman of Lillian's size, accustomed to a life of comfort and confinement, the decision to embark on such an arduous journey was an act of extraordinary courage. It challenged the stereotype of the delicate, helpless white woman, suggesting a strength and determination that her society refused to see. Jacob, too, defied the stereotypes. He was not the brute of Silas's narrative, but a man of intellect and principle. His literacy, a rare and dangerous skill for an enslaved person, was his key to a world beyond Blackwood. The books in the library were not just objects to him, they were tools of liberation. In sharing his knowledge with Lillian, he was not just teaching her about philosophy. He was teaching her about the possibility of a different kind of life. Their alliance was built on a shared love of ideas, but it was also a strategic partnership. Lillian's whiteness and social standing provided a cover that Jacob could never have on his own. She could move through the world in a way that was denied to him. Jacob, in turn, had the practical skills and connections necessary to navigate the treacherous path to freedom. Together, they formed a powerful, if unlikely, team. The fragments of their story that have survived, the journal, the marriage certificate, the whispered accounts, are like pieces of a puzzle. Each one offers a glimpse of the whole, but the complete picture remains elusive. The Philadelphia marriage certificate is perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence that they succeeded. The names are different, but the details align. A woman with a southern accent, a man named Carter, their shared fear and determination. The minister's note about her fuller figure adds a poignant detail, a small but significant confirmation that this was indeed Lillian. If they did make it to Philadelphia, their life there would have been one of constant vigilance. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made no place in the United States truly safe for runaways. Slave catchers roamed the streets of northern cities, empowered by law to seize anyone accused of being an escaped slave and return them to bondage. For an interracial couple like Lillian and Jacob, the danger was even greater. Their very existence was a violation of the racial hierarchy that underpinned American society. Their presumed move to Canada after 1854 makes sense in this context. Canada, as part of the British Empire, had abolished slavery in 1834. It became a haven for thousands of American runaways, a place where they could live in relative freedom without the constant fear of being captured and returned to the South. The discovery of a death certificate in Montreal for an Ellen Carter in 1862, while not definitive proof, adds another layer to this plausible narrative. The note about a journal and a pearl comb, items that were central to Lillian's story, is a tantalizing clue. Did Jacob, honoring his wife's final wishes, try to preserve their story, only to be thwarted by a society that was not yet ready to hear it? The darker narrative, the one whispered by Martha Price's grandmother, cannot be dismissed. The evidence found in the root cellar, the comb, the tool, the letter fragments, places both Lillian and Jacob in that space in the days leading up to their disappearance. The fire that destroyed the house, the traces of accelerants, Silas's hasty departure, all of these point to a cover-up. In this version, the story is not one of triumphant escape, but of tragic failure. It is a story of a dream of freedom crushed by the brutal reality of the slave system. Silas's journal entries from his final years in Paris are perhaps the key to unlocking the mystery. His dream of a heavier, stronger Lillian standing on the riverbank with Jacob can be read in two ways. It could be the manifestation of a guilty conscience, his mind replaying the scene of their murder, transforming his victims into powerful, avenging figures. Or it could be an acknowledgement of their success, a grudging admission that they had managed to escape his control, to become something more than he had ever allowed them to be. The line, "He knew they had come to collect something he owed them," is particularly telling. What did he owe them? Their lives? Their freedom? Or simply the truth? Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Blackwood story is that Silas, even in his final moments, could not or would not pay that debt. He took the full story with him to his grave, leaving behind only a trail of fragments and a legacy of unanswered questions. The fate of Blackwood itself serves as a powerful metaphor. The plantation, once a symbol of order and control, was consumed by fire and reclaimed by the swamp. The land that had been fed with the wrong kind of seed, as the old man told the Union officer, refused to be productive. It became a place of rumor and dread, a wound on the landscape that would not heal. Today, the wildlife management area that encompasses the former plantation is a place of haunting beauty. The cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, stand like silent witnesses. The river moves slowly, its brown water holding the reflections of a sky that has seen too much. Visitors speak of a strange quiet, an expectant stillness, as if the land itself is waiting for the story to be told. The story of Lillian Marsh and Jacob Carter is more than just a historical mystery. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable oppression. It is a story about the courage to cross boundaries, the power of ideas to ignite revolution, and the quiet, persistent ways that history refuses to be silenced. Whether they found their freedom in a new life together or in a shared tragic end, their alliance was an act of defiance that challenged the very foundations of the world they lived in. They were not just a planter's chubby wife and a literate slave. They were two people who found in each other a reflection of their own humanity, a shared desire for a life beyond the confines of their prescribed roles. They dared to imagine a world where they could exist not as master and property but as equals, in a society built on the brutal denial of that possibility. Their story, in all its ambiguity and uncertainty, is a radical act. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of our history, there were moments of light, acts of courage, and alliances that pointed the way toward a more just future. And it challenges us to keep listening for the whispers, to keep piecing together the fragments, to ensure that no story, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable, is ever truly lost. The two narratives of Blackwood, escape and murder, are not mutually exclusive. They exist as two sides of the same coin, each reflecting a different facet of the brutal reality of the antebellum South. The escape narrative speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, the possibility of freedom even in the most oppressive circumstances. The murder narrative speaks to the violent, absolute power of the slave system, its ability to crush any and all dissent. Perhaps the truest way to understand the story of Lillian and Jacob is to hold both possibilities in tension, to recognize that their fate was balanced on a knife's edge. The details matter. Lillian's weight, dismissed by her society as a personal failing, becomes a symbol of her substance, her refusal to be the delicate, ornamental figure she was expected to be. It makes her journey more arduous and therefore her courage more profound. Jacob's literacy, a dangerous anomaly, becomes the key that unlocks not just the library but Lillian's mind and ultimately their shared path to freedom. The books they read were not just entertainment. They were weapons, tools for deconstructing the world that had imprisoned them. The root cellar, a space of darkness and confinement, becomes a site of both terror and possibility. In one version, it is their tomb, the place where their bid for freedom ended in violence. In another, it is the hiding place for the letter that set their escape in motion, a secret chamber where the plan was finalized. The items found there, the comb, the tool, the letter, are relics of a story that can be read in two ways. Are they the last traces of two people about to embark on a journey, or the tragic remnants left behind after a crime. The fire that destroyed the Blackwood mansion is similarly ambiguous. Was it a natural disaster, a random act of lightning that conveniently erased a crime scene? Or was it a deliberate act of arson, a final desperate attempt by Silas to burn away his guilt? The traces of accelerants found by modern investigators suggest the latter, but the truth remains buried beneath layers of ash and time. Even the afterlife of the story, the folklore and ghost sightings can be interpreted in multiple ways. Are the apparitions of Lillian and Jacob on the riverbank the restless spirits of two people murdered before they could find peace? Or are they symbols of their enduring presence, a story so powerful that it imprinted itself on the landscape, refusing to be forgotten? The most compelling aspect of the Blackwood case is how it reveals the mechanics of historical memory. The official record, with its sanitized language and deliberate omissions, was an attempt to control the narrative, to impose a version of events that upheld the existing social order. The story of the lustful slave and the abducted white woman was a convenient fiction, one that reinforced the racist ideology of the time. But the unofficial record, the whispers, the journals, the oral histories persisted, a quiet rebellion against the authorized version of the truth. This is the power of counter-narratives. They are the stories told by those who are denied a voice in the official record. They are messy, contradictory, and often incomplete, but they are also essential. They challenge us to question the stories we have been told, to look for the gaps and silences, to listen for the voices that have been marginalized. The story of Lillian Marsh and Jacob Carter is a story that has been pieced together from these fragments. It is a work of historical reconstruction, an attempt to give voice to two people who were largely erased from the record. It is not a complete story, and it may never be, but its incompleteness is part of its power. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, to acknowledge that the past is not a fixed, stable thing, but a contested territory, a field of competing narratives. In the end, it doesn't matter whether Lillian and Jacob made it to Canada or were buried beneath the foundations of the house they fled. What matters is that they tried. They dared to imagine a different world, a different way of being. They formed an alliance across the deepest and most violently enforced boundary of their time. Their story, whether it ended in triumph or tragedy, is a testament to the enduring human desire for freedom and connection. It is a story that resonates today, in a world still grappling with the legacies of slavery and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a living thing, a conversation between the past and the present. It challenges us to be better historians, better listeners, better citizens. The site of the Blackwood Plantation is now a quiet, overgrown place. The house is gone. The fields have returned to swamp. The whispers have faded. But if you stand there long enough on a hot, humid Mississippi day, you can still feel it. The weight of the untold stories, the presence of the silenced voices, the stubborn, persistent echo of a dream of freedom. Lillian, no longer the delicate flower of society's imagination, but a woman of substance and courage. Jacob, no longer a piece of property, but a man of intellect and principle. Two people who, in a world designed to keep them apart, found a way to come together. Their story is not just a mystery to be solved, it is a lesson to be learned, and it is a story that, once heard, is impossible to forget.